Hi, standing in front of our apple tree, one of our fruit trees in the backyard of our home in the Galil, in Eretz Israel, beautiful, blessed land, given to the Jewish people. Today's parsha speaks about the Meraglim, the spies, and the story of their mission and the way they didn't quite fulfill it the way it was expected, the consequences, but there's a lot more to be learned from this about the unfathomable, truly unfathomable ways in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. Now the Pasha begins, Shlach Lecha. It sounds like any other mitzvah, any other commandment. But it's clear for anyone who reads Rashi, and Rashi is very disturbed by the idea that it could be a commandment, it could be a mitzvah. And he explains it, the Da'atcha, as if God is only sort of giving advice, though I'm not quite sure what the operative difference is between getting advice from HaKadosh Baruch Hu and getting a command from him. Then it says a few verses later that Moshe sent out the spies al pi Hashem, again making it clear, I think, that this was a divine command. And again, Moshe says, Rashi explains, well, it means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't interfere, didn't prevent. And other Meforshim, especially the Maharal, who, as you know, elaborates on Rashi and defends Rashi against his critics, go to great lengths to try to show that Shlach Lecha is not a straightforward command. But other people, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and I think many others, realize that this is not true, that the simple biblical style, Shlach Lecha, Lech Lecha, Aseh Lecha, it's a biblical style for making a command, and this was a mitzvah. Now, why would it be so disturbing this to be a mitzvah? Well, again, reading Rashi and some of the other people, it looks like the reason would be some differences, not quite contradictions, but glaring differences between the story we have it here, as we have it here, and the story in Devarim, when Moshe is sort of recalling for the Jewish people what they went through the last 40 years. But I think that the reason is really much more is different, and the real reason why Rashi and others are so disturbed by the idea that Kadosh Baruch Hu could have given Moshe the command is the consequences. That's led to the spies giving their report, which led to the Jews crying, which led to the delay in entry to Eretz Israel for 40 years as a punishment. And it seems incomprehensible that the Kadosh Baruch Hu would not have known this. You don't really need divine foreknowledge after following the behavior of the Jewish people during these days of the Exodus. Know that they were not quite receptive to everything that happened, and so it should have been clear that something like this would happen. And yet, HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded Moshe to send the spies, and when the result, which could have been foreseen by just about anyone, came to pass, they were punished. This calls for further reflection. Now, in order to understand just what a somber and almost incomprehensible message or meaning lies behind this story, we have to go back to the very beginning of the Exodus, Parshat B'Shalach. It says immediately upon describing the B'Shalach Hashem, when God took the Jews out of Egypt, Lo nacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim ki karovu, kemar Elohim pe'ir ha'adam milchama v'shavu mitzrayma. That God decided not to guide the Jewish people on the direct path to Eretz Israel, through the land of the Philistines, the northern coast of Sinai, out of a concern that they would see war, and that would cause them to want to come back to Egypt. Now the Rambam explains this in quite detail in his guide, in a very reasonable way, and of course fitting with his overall hashkafa. The Jews were a group of slaves, used to being beaten, kicked around, slaves of almost no identity, And when you see the stories that we've had so far, they don't remember being beaten. They have good memories of being fed. They remember the food, that was good. The fact that they were beaten and kicked around, they don't remember it. It doesn't seem to bother them too much. This kind of people cannot be a warrior nation, cannot go into their homeland and retake it. And so the Rambam tells us they had to have a new generation. Not enough simply to delay the entry into Eretz Yisrael by taking a circuitous route, but we needed to have a brand new generation, people who have been born into freedom and also born into the harsh conditions of the desert, which the Torah describes as a place without water, with scorpions and snakes and all sorts of dangerous animals. And people who are born under those harsh conditions and who have never known the whip of the oppressor, they are the people who are fit for battle. This is naturalistic explanation, if you wish, but it's a true one. So this means that the Jewish people would have had to have, had the generation see the generation who would come out of Egypt, those who were born and raised in slavery, pass on. And yet, we have here the story of it coming about as a punishment for a sin. So, what do we do with it? Now, in order to flesh out this point, we have to look at a different source. The last Mishnah in Masechet Brachot. The Mishnah talks about the pasuk in Tehillim, "Eit lasot Lashem eferu Toratecha," and the Gemara tells us that Chazal decided that the best way, or maybe the only way, to handle this pasuk, to make sense out of it, would be to reorder the verse. Heferu Toratecha, eit lasot Lashem. According in English, more or less, the literal meaning is eit lasot Lashem heferu Toratecha. It's time for God to act. They have violated your Torah. And Chazal decided that the way to understand the pasuk is to have it read, they have violated your Torah, so it's time to act for Hashem. And of course, in this way that I've just said, we understand this is the way the traditional explanation, that when in times of great crisis, let us call it, and there's a danger of almost a complete collapse of Jewish observance and Jewish values, then the Chazal may find it necessary to suspend even a biblical commandment. It is used notably to justify writing down what was called the oral Torah. That is to say, Eit Lasot Lashem, it was time to act on behalf of God, or because Heferu Toratecha, because the Torah was not being kept and observed, and in order to do this, we would have to write down a written code, write the oral Torah as a written code that would have the authority and the accessibility and so on of the written Torah. And in fact, the Rambam himself cites this verse in justifying his writing his guide for the perplexed, where he also felt that he had perhaps been writing down things that were not meant to be written, but were meant to remain hidden or transmitted only discreetly from one worthy scholar to another. Now, what happens, however, the Rambam is of the opinion, and that's probably not just the Rambam, that even when Chazal have a good reason to take the verse not in its literal sense, but the literal sense retains its meaning. For instance, Lo tochlu al adam. This is a verse from Dvarim, which means literally don't eat all over the blood, which Chazal have taken to mean many things, that one should not, for instance, eat before praying in the morning, before we've prayed for our blood, or if the court, in one of its rare instances, decides to exercise capital punishment, then the judges should fast on that day because they shouldn't eat on the same day that they are ordering the spilling of blood. But the Rambam says this verse must have literal meaning, and he finds in his study of old pagan practices that there was a pagan practice to slaughter an animal and spill the blood in a hole in the ground, and 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 the belief that this would bring in the demons that people wanted to converse with. They would have a feast around this blood. So it had some meaning in its literal sense, which fits perfectly the Torah's chief aim, which is to counter pagan practices. Now, in his commentary on that Mishnah, Maimonides, the Rambam, says, well, now what would be the meaning of this verse if we had left it, if we, as he said, we had abandoned it to its literal reading? He says, and the meaning would be, Eit lasot Hashem, the time has come, the divinely preordained, foreordained moment for wreaking vengeance has come. Heferu Toratecha, causes will come about. God will manipulate things in such a way that people will sin, Heferu Toratecha, and that justifies the punishment that had been divinely foreordained for that moment anyway. Something which is almost impossible to believe that the Rambam says it, but he does, and he means it. This verse tells us that there are these foreordained moments for divine vengeance, but in order that they be justified, people have got to sin before them, and if necessary, God will intervene to cause them to sin. Hard to believe that he says this, but he does say this, and he tries immediately to sort of, I think, to lead us on a magical mystery tour of various arguments. But in the end, it basically comes down to that this is divine justice, not human justice, and we are pledged to believe. Here, I would actually use the word belief, that God is just, though we cannot understand. That's the main point. We do not know what divine justice is, what it means. We know what we think to be right or wrong, what we think to be just or not just, but we can't really impose this on HaKadosh Baruch Hu and judge him as to whether he's acted in a just manner or not. And I think there are several examples that can be brought for this sort of thing happening. Of course, the Rambam is talking also about some future event, but the story of the spies and the exodus from Egypt, I think, is a perfect example. It was divinely ordained. And the Torah tells us, Vahi b'shalach paro ta'am. As soon as Paro had sent the Jews out of Egypt, it was foreordained. It was a divine decision or a divine decree that the Jews would take a long route. A long route meaning long enough for the generation of those who had left to die off, a new generation to be born, before they would enter Eretz Yisrael. And then we have the story of the spies, where Hashem tells Moshe, Shalach lecha, commands him to send the spies. And then when the spies come, the outcome is not at all surprising, given the way the Jews have complained. In the last week's parasha, we saw Taveira, the Kevrot Ta'ava, not at all surprising. So it looks as if something that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Moshe had been given a mitzvah, a command to send the spies, and this, in the end, led to the punishment which brought about the result that had been foreordained beforehand, that the Jews would wander in the desert for 40 years, the entire generation of slaves, of freed slaves, would die off, and a new generation would be born. Lo machshavotay machshavotchem, lo derechai darchechem, Ne'um Hashem. The ways of God are unfathomable. This is not a cliche. It's not something to be sort of, to spit out and then go on and pass judgment and offer all sorts of explanations for things we don't understand. We simply don't understand. What we do know is that we are commanded to do the good. And here again, Kalev and Yoshua did the good, and they got into Eretz Yisrael. Now, I don't want to end on too somber a note. After all, we did get to Eretz Yisrael, and we came back to Eretz Yisrael a few times after being kicked out, and we're back again, and I hope we're worthy of staying here for good this time. And you can see here apples from our fruit tree, which prove just how productive and fruitful Eretz Yisrael is for the Jewish people. And on this same optimistic note, it's important to call attention to something that most Meforshim do, and that is right after the story of the spies and this harsh decree that was given. We have two parshiot that have to do with mitzvot tzliot ba'aretz, which begin by saying "B'voachem el haaretz, ki tavo el haaretz," that God immediately after telling that generation that they would not live to enter Israel, reaffirms His promise that the Jews will enter the land that God has promised to the Jewish people, and gives us some new mitzvot to do there. So let's just admit that Darchei Hashem are beyond our comprehension, that we simply must do what is right, and Baruch Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu keeps His promise to give us our land. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.